Let's begin. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for this conversation with policies and training at the Immigration Advisory Service, prior to which he worked as a legal officer at the Refugee Legal Centre. It's my pleasure to join Colin today to talk about his much anticipated book, which of course is out today in all good bookstores. To post questions there. We probably won't have time to get through all of them, but we will try to get through some of them, if not most of them, at the end of this conversation. So some people joining us, you came to immigration law, what drew you to it, and how that journey has helped shape the thinking that we see in this book.
Well, first of all, before I say anything about that, just thank you very much for agreeing to help with this, Sapir. It's very much appreciated. Yeah, I think like quite a lot of immigration lawyers, I kind of fell into immigration law. So I was looking for an area of law to work in, and a friend of a friend worked for a charity called the Immigration. Somebody was desperate enough to want to take me on. It was a time, this was in 2000s. There was a big surge in the number of asylum seekers. The government funding for this kind of work was quite generous in those days. And I think that's how people saw it at the time, but certainly in hindsight it was. And there was a big demand for legal services, and I kind of was able to get a job despite not having a lot of experience or really any experience in the field at that time. And then I worked for charities for 6 years, reluctantly came to the bar to finish my qualifications. I took a sabbatical from my job. I didn't tell the chambers, they're now defunct, so it doesn't matter. I can say this in public. I didn't tell the chambers that I was joining Renaissance, that I fully intended to go back. It's been 20 years, 6 years for charities, and then the rest of it as a self-employed barrister.
Great. Now this book is, it really speaks to the sort of breadth and depth and length of your experience that you have developed. It's laden with numbers and references to cases and to legislation. It's a very rigorous, forensic, and quite a stark account of how our borders came to be, quite as broken as they are today. And I think anyone who's got even a passing interest in immigration law and policy should go out and buy a copy and read it. But it's also a great book about people. In every chapter, there's vivid, really sensitively told stories about individuals and families whose lived reality is then up at her house and detain her and her partner for 2 weeks or tried. Some of these cases are absurd, they're heartbreaking, they're sort of unbelievable. Now, I, of course, I know the answer in some ways to this question, but for everybody else watching, how representative are these cases of what you see as an immigration lawyer? How bad is it? And do you feel that it's gotten worse over time?
Oh, well, obviously the truth is that I've picked those examples partly because they seem quite stark, and partly because also they're representative of deeper problems in the system. And that's what I've tried to do throughout the book, is kind of illustrate the points that I'm trying to make by telling real life stories. And some of those are drawn from the case reports. They're not cases that I was personally involved with, and others of them are cases that from my own personal experience, or a few of them in the family chapter where I spoke to people specifically for the purpose of writing the book. And it's that big difference, isn't it, between migrants and immigration, or immigrants and immigration. And the kind of people who are much more sympathetic are capable of seeing migrants as human beings, as people, as neighbours, and so on. And the people who are much less sympathetic quite often see it as a phenomenon, as an issue, as opposed to as a bunch of people. And that's one of the big breakthroughs with immigration issues, I think, is where you can get people to start reconceiving of immigration as being a lot of immigrants whose lives are profoundly affected by these laws. Then that makes a big difference. And just as an aside, as a barrister, when you're in court, one of your big jobs is to try and get the judge to see your client as being an actual human being, as opposed to just an example of a trend that they're familiar with from other cases or something like that. So sort of trying to personalize things is a really important advocacy tool, both in court, but also I think as a sort of campaigner and in a wider sense.
Now, in the book, you go all the way back to 1962 with the Commonwealth Immigrants Act. Um, what do you feel the direction of travel has been since then? Where has it?
Back to 1962. Yeah, I think you can break it into phases, and I think there's a period really from the 60s onwards where what academics have described as a zero immigration policy. And it's not that there was literally no immigration. There was actually a reasonable amount of immigration from the 60s onwards, even after the restrictive legislation of 1962, 1968, and so on. But the idea was basically to keep immigrants out and only to allow in the bare minimum that were necessary for family reunion. There were very few work permits, that kind of thing. And almost no asylum seekers in those days, just a handful, really. And then that kind of strict application of entry criteria, strict entry rules, proved to be insufficient for keeping immigrants out in the 1990s with the growth of the numbers of asylum seekers from the early 90s onwards. And a new raft of policies starts to get introduced, these kind of deterrent policies. So not only have you got policies trying to keep people out, that sort of restrict the actual entry rules, but also you've got a set of policies that try to persuade people not to come in the first place, even if they come irregularly or illegally, in the language that ministers prefer. And you see that with the kind of cuts to asylum seekers. But what's interesting is that around the same time, suddenly the entry rules are liberalized to a significant extent. I don't want to overstate that too much. The family rules were never liberalized, and all the economic migration routes. So instead of the zero immigration policy of the kind of post-war years from 1960s onwards, you've got a policy of actually welcoming in certain types of migrants. And then from 2010 onwards, not only do you close up the entry routes again and reintroduce the kind of attempt at zero immigration, but you also spread the deterrent policies to all types of migrants as well. It's just this all-out assault on the idea of immigration, sort of driven by the net migration target not liking immigration. I think when it comes down to it, that's ultimately what drives the net migration target. And yeah, you get this tightening up of the entry rules combined with this horrendous range of deterrent policies like the hostile environment, citizen-on-citizen immigration checks, and so on, all with the intent
of overwhelmingly negative for the people who have to cross those borders, for people who have crossed them and who are living here. And one thing that really stands out is you don't shy away in this book from explicitly saying that a lot of this is incredibly political. Quite early on in the book, you mention race as a driver of legislation in the 1960s. I think at one point you say that successive governments have basically pursued an exclusionary citizenship policy that's rooted in race. And you describe throughout the book a system of borders that, through successive governments has pretty much failed everyone. Wherever your opinion is, whatever you think about, you say is the kind of driver of that failure. If we think about any area of policy, whether it was agriculture or tax or aviation or something, it's pretty hard to conceive that governments for 40, 50 years.
And if I allow me to be flippant for a moment, it's great for business when you're an immigration lawyer, because suddenly everybody needs our help. And it makes me sound ancient saying this, but when I started out as a young immigration lawyer, you didn't need help with a spouse visa, for example, or even necessarily with a work permit application. They were things that help was optional, like doing a tax return. Unless your case was unusually complicated, you could just get on with it and do it yourself. And that I don't really think that's true anymore. I'm always a bit nervous of overstating how complicated things are, because it sounds like a lawyer pitching for business and do it by themselves. But as to what's driven the mess and how something so unsatisfactory for everyone has been allowed to come about, I don't have easy answers. It's a combination of different things. One of the things I suggest in the book, which isn't necessarily terribly helpful because it's almost impossible now to change, is and this is sort of a lawyer answer as well, but I think there's some validity to it, is the structure of immigration law. Because the foundation of immigration law is the Immigration Act 1971. And when that legislation was passed, Parliament, in a relatively restrained way, and I don't want to say the rules were great or anything like that, but you didn't see them being changed on a regular basis. The first ever set of immigration rules were actually voted down by Parliament, and I don't think that's ever happened since. There's basically almost no parliamentary scrutiny, and the rules can be changed at will by the Home Office without any input from civil society, without any opportunity for lobbying or for external input, without any input from other government departments, and they can just act on their own. And that's great. They feel that's to a significant extent to blame for the mess we've ended up in, because you've got this kind of layered set of rules that have been introduced over many years, where rules still exist that go back to the 1970s, like certainly the 1980s, like the UK ancestry visa. Why does that still exist? Why hasn't that been reformed? And the tests that you still see for spouses, the genuine and subsisting marriage, there's some really antiquated language that's still used there. So you've got this kind of different generations of rules that have been introduced at different times, and it's a terrible mess. And I think one of the things I've said in the book is that it's naive to think that that's not now a deliberate tool of policy. Basically, the fact that it's such a mess, I think, has come about because of structural reasons, but also through incompetence. But it's kind of, I feel like it's been embraced by government since sort of 2010 onwards as being a useful risk of falling into illegality and being forced out of the system. And I think that's basically become deliberate now. So we've got, the lawyers amongst us will know that there's what we call the simplification project going on, the Law Society, the Law Commission is working on a new set of rules and so on. The Home Office is talking the talk of simplification, and it certainly sounds like it's going to be a bit better than it is at the moment. But being as it's so awful at the moment, that's not necessarily saying very much. And I'm a bit skeptical about whether the reform is really going to be all that serious or well intentioned.
And of course, one aspect of the kind of massive nebulous set of complicated, sometimes unwieldy, unworkable, and in some places, I guess, incompatible with each other rules around immigration is that you end up with the legal system not necessarily aligning with life, with reality. And in your book, when you talk about family, when you talk about people who build lives in a place where they sort of put down roots, you quite explicitly say that people aren't going anywhere. They have come here, this is their home, they live here for all intents and purposes, this is where they belong now. And the law doesn't necessarily reflect that. Do you think that increasing use of complexity, the increasing use of sort of enforcement or deterrent measures in the immigration system has contributed to kind of people not remaining document terms for it? So I'll let you choose which one you use now.
Yeah, and it's interesting the language, and I've started the book with a short note on terminology, which is a really exciting start to a book, obviously. And I've plumped for the word unauthorized population, and the reason for that is because I feel a bit Windrush problem was people who were lawfully resident but didn't have people are lawfully resident. So the word I've used is unauthorized, and that's used by some academics as well. So it's not that I've cooked that up completely by myself. And unauthorized migrants there are in the UK, and there have been a couple of research reports recently which have given estimates which are quite different. There was the Pew research where they gave a range, the upper end of which was 1.2 million, figure 600,000 to 1.2 million, which is quite and there does seem to have been a very substantial growth in that population. That's what the research suggests, and common sense would suggest it. There have been all sorts of policies that we would have expected to have increased the unauthorized population, the immigration fees, the complexity, that all goes to sort of force people out of legal status, and yet it doesn't do enough to force them out of the country. And and that's a real problem. It's kind of the hostile environments, that there are only around 8,000 removals, and it seems to me that it's an issue that certainly shouldn't be ignored. I'd like to say can't be ignored, but you don't know with politicians. They're quite good at ignoring things when they want to. But it feels like no responsible politician could ignore that any longer, and that we really do have to look at ways of bringing as many people in one go into legality, but also creating some proper long-term regularization routes in order to stop that population from building up again, and also reform the rules again with a view to stopping that population from growing up again. Because having a really large unauthorized population it's not just a disaster for them, but it's a social disaster just generally. Having a kind of large, illegal, exploitable,
incredibly easy to become undocumented while being incredibly difficult to become documented again, which really speaks to the sort of length to which, or the need for those safer, sort of more accessible routes to regularization. Towards the end of the book, you lay out a sort of roadmap and a kind of set recommendations. Some of it's very common sense stuff, very pragmatic, very practical, and it's sort of hard to disagree with any of it. Although I'm sure that ministers will find some inventive way, if they were forced to read this book, to find objections to it. If you were sort of charged today with, undertaking this kind of reform, fixing these broken borders, creating a fairer system that sort of works better for everyone, including those that use it, what would the priorities be? Where would you begin?
I think the standout one, but secondly, it punishes even those who can afford to pay them, and it hampers their life chances, and it hampers the life chances of their children. It gives them a lot less disposable income than they would otherwise choose whether to come in the first place or not. And we can have arguments about, a lot of us would welcome migration, some people don't, but I can see that having fees at the initial entry point isn't quite as objectionable as having the fees once you're here, because it just doesn't force people to leave if they can't pay them. They do end up going underground. So the fees will be a really important start, but that's a really trivial issue as well in some ways, in the sort of wider sense, because it doesn't deal with any of the serious structural issues with immigration and citizenship. And that's, I use the word citizenship as well, because it's not just about immigration. I think a lot flows from the very exclusionary approach to citizenship that the United found in memos. There is an official policy keeper to citizenship status as well. So I think having a proper deep think about what our approach to citizenship is seems to me to be a good starting point. And that's also because it's not just, I think it really helps inform what then follows in how we talk about immigration, but it's also potentially a bit less controversial than talking about immigration. I think there's more potential for cross-party political support. Does that help people integrate, or is it a reward for having integrated? I don't know. Those sorts of issues I think are actually very important. If citizenship is about integration, then why have we got a test that excludes certain people? And there's a racial element to that. If you look at the numbers of people who fail the test from white-dominated countries, then it's very low. If you look at the number of people who fail the test from countries with a high sort of Black or Asian population, it's quite interesting, I think. There was a time when citizenship was discussed properly, and I don't want to look back on David Blunkett's tenure as Home Secretary with too much fondness, because a lot of us felt very critical of what he was doing at the time. But at least he was talking about these things and thinking about these things in a way we just haven't seen since then, for example. And having a test that bars some educative function, so that's kind of, it doesn't seem, it seems perhaps counterintuitive to start with citizenship, because that's not the big pressing issue as far as most people are concerned, but that's perhaps makes it an easier starting point in some ways, a less charged starting point, and it's a more profound starting point that might then have other consequences later on.
I think that goes to the heart of, you use the phrase citizens in waiting to describe, the ideal type approach to people who arrive in the UK. And perhaps, there is some use in looking at immigration policy through the lens of, what happens once people are here? What is the sort of pathway towards folks as government ministers or campaigners? That when we talk about our immigration system and our borders, that we tend towards a discussion of the border as sort of something that people cross, and therefore we're talking about what happens, what that journey is like when people.
Non-negotiable that once migrants are here, they need to be treated with respect and humanity, and be given a route to properly settle and become citizens. Not least because then they're not leaving. They're not going anywhere. And once a migrant is admitted for and the idea that we should be punishing them with double taxation, making their lives really it just doesn't make any sense. It's crazy. So I think that is really important. Yes.
Well, we're at the half hour mark, so I'm going to turn to some of the questions that we've got, and I can see the Q&A thing lighting up, and I've got some questions that we received a little bit early. Disclosure. This is from Olu. At the risk of preemptive disclosure, still await my copy of the book. Did you find a correlation between the control of immigration and illegal migration? If so, what direction has it taken?
I think that sort of touches on what we were just talking about, doesn't it? So. With this sort of unauthorized population, and it's this difference between the wishful thinking of politicians, where they think that other people's lives are very simple. The notion in Theresa May's head, and say with family, I think family is a really good example of this, because ministers or Theresa May, they never would, or should that family have never formed in the first place? And one suspects that it's the latter that they hope for, but that's not the reality of people's lives. In the gaps, and you see these absurd reasons for refusal letters referring to staying in touch by modern means of communication and all this kind of stuff. But I feel a little teeny bit of sympathy for civil servants having to fill in the gaps where it's ministers who've made these decisions, and the ministers haven't given any steer. They haven't said what their expectation is or how the policy will actually work in practice. And then maybe they just hope that these families would vanish or something. I don't know. But yeah, there is this big gulf between what ministers.
Communication idea, but it's also something that I feel perhaps, after lockdown lifts and people are sort of talking about the people to do this. And we certainly see, letter upon letter from constituency MPs on behalf of clients and people we work with, which explicitly tells people that they should have been in full awareness of the immigration rules at the time in which they entered into a relationship, which is the most miraculous kind of intellectual acrobatics that's being done there. I've got a question here from I've got a lot of people
believe that she's serious. I just can't. I'd love to be proven wrong on that. Maybe seriously, maybe they are actually going to do some serious deep thinking and introspection about what they've done to people. But their history is such that I really just can't believe it. I'm going to flip that one for you. What do you make of it at JCWI, you guys?
The line is that we're encouraged by her commitment, but the jury is very much out. I'm personally quite surprised that the Home Secretary said point blank, I will implement all 30 recommendations, and then you sort of think, well, you're quite wedded to doing the exact opposite of what those recommendations say, and you ran for election, you got an 80-seat majority on a manifesto that pointed to doing the exact opposite. You have a constituency that you bait over the issue of doing the exact opposite. So I think we'll just have to wait and see, and obviously keep a very close eye on it. I do have very low expectations. Fees is not exactly the most systemic change, but but just changing fees and lowering them can actually have a real sizable, tangible impact. From Leanne, just see if I can pull it up. In an ideal world, and I guess this is referring to the power that the Home Secretary has through secondary legislation, how could Parliament become more involved?
Close the book with, I think it's at the end of the conclusion, in fact, is saying that ideally, so I think some parliamentary input into the immigration rules could be transformative. Now that's really naive and optimistic potentially, but because we were talking about this earlier with the way that the 1971 Act sort of panacea, it doesn't necessarily, and the quality of parliamentary debate isn't that great, frankly, sometimes, but at least it offers an opportunity for input from outside sources and for lobbying, for civil society, and for other immigration in ways that seem to be sort of self-harming for the country. I would say is a very good thing, but it's almost impossible because of the structure of immigration law, and no one seems to be suggesting rewriting the 1971 Act or the government, the executive, giving away its powers to do exactly what it wants when it wants. So yes, it could, but probably no, it won't, I think, in answer to the question.
David Owen asks whether asylum and migration policy should be removed from the Home Office, and if policy be distributed across different ministries, business, education, foreign office, etc.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm a bit skeptical that of how it would work in practice, because presumably the reality is that although you might take some of those functions or all of those functions from the Home Office, you'd also move the civil servants responsible for it. And I'm not sure that certainly in the short term would necessarily have any beneficial impact. But on the other hand, it's hard to see how the Home Office could do a worse job than they have been so far. And, again, moving those kind of functions to different departments would allow for input of different thinking, and perhaps, not quite the same, different departmental cultures having an influence, and not having the same kind of Millwall fan attitude of, everyone hates us, we don't care at the Home Office, which seems to sort of dominate their approach to life. But I don't, could flow from the Wendy Williams review, and if that was taken serious and was properly implemented, then having that kind of leadership at the Home Office might make a difference. And policy and the way that there was this revolution in thinking at the Home Office, led essentially by David Blunkett, but really because he came along at the right time. It was already in train. You had people like Jonathan Portes at the Cabinet Office, who were sort of leading a change in thinking and owe their power to being tough on immigration, tough on immigrants. And it's hard to imagine them of 80. And the way that parliamentary democracy works in the UK, when you've got a majority like that, you can do what you want. You're not sort of beholden to a tiny number of MPs who could sort of stop being proposed. But there is potential for positive change, I think. Whether it actually happens, is a bit questionable. But for asylum seekers in particular, I think is a real danger time for asylum policy over the next couple of years. There's now a really substantial asylum backlog, and you can see that it's maybe not awful if you treat asylum seekers badly for a short time, and then the genuine refugees are given proper help to integrate, get themselves set up in life and so on. That's not happening at the moment. They're being treated appallingly for ages, and then over half of them are getting asylum. And again, it just doesn't, it's irrational. It just doesn't make any sense. Half of these people are going to be allowed to stay in the country long term. Why are we treating them so abysmally for such a prolonged period of time, where they're waiting for their asylum claims to be decided, and then expecting them to gratefully integrate and do well in life, having suffered appallingly in the meantime? So I know that's certainly pretty bad news in the short term. Plus, with Brexit, the end of the Dublin Convention, if somebody comes in via Greece or Italy or France, they're fingerprinted on their journey to the UK, they somehow get across the channel, they get here, they're fingerprinted by the Home Office here in the UK, that's checked against database, a European database, the Eurodac database. The fact that we won't be able to return people when the whatever it is or something, but people seem to get, they'll probably end up resorting to some pretty negative politics to crack down even more on something that already seems to be pretty cracked, frankly.
Sort of every so often have to do a little cleaning up of who I'm following and not following on Twitter, because every so often you will see the usual suspects. Bring me a speedboat and 20 cameras immediately. I must go out and pose next to a small number of desperate people clinging to a life raft. Let me just and of course, COVID has led to all sorts of negative impacts on household income, and there's clearly not been enough guidance or response to that from the Home Office. So Caroline's asking, how do they get away with this?
Is able to get away with it is the law is a very poor tool for tackling this kind of injustice. And the minimum income rule was challenged through the courts. There was a kind of partial victory, but the law isn't a very good way of trying to deal with these things. And the narrative on immigration in the sort of public sphere has been so negative for so long that being tough on charts. There aren't too many charts, everybody, don't worry. But they didn't want any charts. And I was like, well, actually, there's a few. I like charts, and there's a few that I wanted to get in there to sort of, because it makes the point visually very well. And one of them shows just the absolute sort of nosediving of concern about immigration since the referendum in 2016. And we saw, I talk about this in the book, so there's a difficult racial dimension to this. I think we saw a lot of stories about white, professional, middle-class families being affected by the ridiculous position of the Home Office on permanent residence. And that seems to shock people. People weren't shocked when it was poor people who were black or brown. They just thought, well, that's what we want, actually. But when it's Home Office, this narrative started to grow that the Home Office was failing. And then there was some fantastic work by Amelia Gentleman, where I think she acknowledges in her book, the space for her to tell the stories of the Windrush generation had kind of been opened up. We're going to see positive change, but it feels like we could do at least.
It's a question from me. We've got a couple more that we'll try and get through, but something that comes up when you sort of discuss that narrative, that clearly very racialized frame in which we talk about some migrants and other migrants, some sort of pick up the public attention and or trigger interest from journalists or policymakers. Do you think that we are sometimes at risk, particularly when you see the type of lobbying that might go on around the immigration bill? You'll have, the sort of business groups saying that actually we need much more liberal borders, and you'll have other groups talking about sort of rights-based approaches to things rather than just numbers. Do you think that sometimes with that direction of travel in the public conversation, which you say is becoming a bit more positive, that we're at risk of becoming pro-immigration without ever being pro-migrant?
I think that's a really important point, actually. I think I'm sort of reluctant to say this in public, and this feels pretty public, even though I'm just in a room by myself. I don't really care that much how many migrants come into the UK in the first place. I'm very liberal. I welcome immigration. I'm not that bothered about how many numbers. I don't particularly want to increase the numbers. I haven't got a number that I'm aiming at. I feel people move around. I'm not holding out any flame to particularly increase immigration, but it's just non-negotiable that the people who do come have to be treated properly. And I think I'm worried that is a bit close to a very discredited position. And a lot of this is still things that I'm thinking through as well. And I welcome these kind of conversations. The discredited position from the 60s and 70s that you had to keep immigration low and keep the numbers down, but have anti-discrimination laws. And it feels like both parts of that equation got broken, and then you've got EU accession. There's very substantial immigration. and the anti-discrimination stuff stayed in place for a time. But since 2010, with the hostile environment, we've actually had government-sanctioned deliberate policy of increasing discrimination, which again is just seems insane to me that that's actually official government policy, but it is. And yeah, I'm not advocating for low numbers and anti-discrimination, but I'm not as bothered, I'm not as exercised about the numbers, and I'm not particularly pro-immigration. I don't feel like I'm part of an immigration lobby particularly, but you've got to treat migrants properly and treat them with respect, and seeing them as citizens in waiting, which it's a phrase that's used in the States by campaigners. And it's actually, it's really interesting looking at the history of this, actually official status in the United States for many years. One of the things I was looking at was a couple of books by an American at the time. You shouldn't force them, but hopefully they'll want to become citizens. At least a lot of them will, and those who don't, that's fine, but you want to encourage them to do that. And that really changes the way that you think about these policies that are deliberately punishing them and actually making their lives harder in the UK.
Yeah, I think sometimes when I'm asked if I'm pro-immigration, I think it's a bit like asking what your opinion is on whether the sun should rise. It's just a thing. It's going to happen. We have to make sure that our laws don't ruin people's lives in the process. Final question here. We've got from Minnie, who asks, given everything that we've seen and that we've learned over the last 3 months of COVID-19 with people from BME background and access to healthcare, what policy lessons and what lessons more generally should we be learning and taking away from the experience of the last 3 months in order to fix our broken borders?
I think one lesson, it's a really impossible question to answer. I think one lesson is...
Answer in 3 minutes if you can.
Yeah, I think we're just out of time. I think one lesson to take away from the last few months is to take our wins where we can find them, because as a kind of sector, we're so used to losing on these issues over and over again over the last decade, basically. And we've seen a number of different successful campaigns involving migrants and immigration on the NHS surcharge and so on. And there are some who say, well, we shouldn't just accept the NHS, the immigration health surcharge being waived for some migrants. That's just not good enough. It needs to be waived for all migrants. And well, yes, that's true, but let's take what we can get. Lootist, we've got to have it all or nothing. I think we have had some wins, and it's one of the reasons. This is possibly a bit of a pessimistic note to end on. So maybe they've been careful not to introduce things that they can't then reverse easily, because those kind of scraps, if you just put a few things on a web page, kind of the default position really is that those are temporary.
And Paddington comes up quite a bit in the book. Over to you, Colin. I don't know what question comes out of that, but I'm just
funny, isn't it? Especially, a lot of people only know me through writing about Paddington. Those sort of blog posts went quite big and ended up in newspapers and so on as well. But I think he's a really good example of a migrant success story. Of course, unfortunately, it's a fictional example. He offers an opportunity to sort of think about the way that we welcome people, the obstacles that we've erected in the path of a kind of hypothetical Paddington, and to kind of communicate how immigration law works. And that's kind of what I've tried to do with the book. And it was partly a personal thing. I wanted to do some reading and to force myself to do some reading. I made myself do some writing as well, and sort of two go together for me. But also, hopefully, to try and communicate how the immigration system really is to a wider readership. And as far as I can tell from, because I don't have any sort of sales figures, as far as I can tell, lots of people seem to be interested in our sector, in our in-group of people who are pretty sympathetic to these issues to start, to try and help people understand how awful the system really is and the impact that it actually has on people's lives.
And accessible writing, for which I am not trained. Researching and writing the book has been a voyage of discovery for me, and I am acutely conscious that there is much about race, policy, and advocacy that I only partially understand. I am only a lawyer, and if you'd like to know more, again, this book is available pretty much everywhere from today, I think.
Yeah, it seems to be sold out on Amazon, bizarrely.
Are now reopened, so yeah. Shop local if you can and pick up a copy.
All right.
Thanks, Colin.
Thanks very much, Satbir, and bye bye everybody else as well.